By the second summer, after Ezra Vaughan had come and gone and come back to stay, people in the valley would quit calling the Haywood place a dry hole. Cora did not know that yet. She knew only that the home meadow carried less grass every year, that the stock tank stood a hand lower each August than the August before, and that the men who had ridden up to look at her water had each looked and shaken their heads and ridden off without leaving anything behind worth keeping. Shaw had been among them. Boyd had been among them, and she had begun, against the better part of her own judgment, to believe them. That was the piece she could not forgive herself, because she had known where the trouble was for 3 years. She walked the draw every spring the way Nate had taught her, and by now better than Nate had taught her, and she had found it. Above the third gate, where the draw pinched in and the old line crossed the seep, the spring box had caved. She had gone down far enough with a spade, twice, to be sure of it. The timber cribbing that gathered Cold Spring folded in on itself, and the buried line below it pulled apart at a joint, so that the water no longer ran down to the meadow, but backed up and drowned the seep and stood where it should have moved. The meadow below took the drowning first, and then, in the dry weeks, baked hard and wrong, because the water that should have kept it through July was soaking uselessly into a hillside a quarter-mile up. She could not dig the box out and crib it new and hold the head of water and relay the line all by herself. And the money that would have paid a crew to do it was the money a failing horse ranch no longer made. She had covered the hole back over both times and walked down and gone inside and started supper. The men had come. They had stood where she told them to stand and looked where she told them to look, and said the spring was giving out, and this was dry country and hard luck to her, and ridden home to their own good water. She had stopped asking them. What she had never once done was stop knowing. Ezra Vaughan came up the valley road on a Thursday in late April, when the cottonwoods along the creek were just breaking into leaf. He stopped because his horse wanted water, and he wanted a meal, and the saloon was the only building in that town with a lamp still burning past 8. He took a place at the far end of the bar and ate without talking to anyone. He was most of the way through his plate when the talk at the round table against the back wall reached him. 3 men with their chairs drawn in close and their voices set low to be private, which in a quiet room only meant a man at the bar could hear them plainly. They were talking about a widow's place north of town, the spring failing on it. The horses sold off a few head at a time, the hay meadow thinning year on year. One of them said what that ground would fetch by the acre, an exact figure, the sort of number a man does not have to reach for. And the other 2 took it in without a flicker, the way men take a thing they have already settled among themselves. Ezra had spent a dozen years finding and moving and mending water in country that did not give it up easy, and he knew the difference between a spring that has played out and a spring that has been let die. He finished his plate. He turned his coffee cup once on the wood and set it down. Then he ordered a second cup he did not need and stayed at the bar a good while longer than he had meant to. He rode out past the Haywood place the next morning before he did anything else. What he found at the fence was not a dying ranch. What he found was some of the best watered ground in the valley being choked to death by a caved box and a broken line. The meadow lay on a bed of clay that would hold water better than most soil in the district if the line above it were running as it was built to run. The few horses left in the near pasture stood at the rail with the good bone and the good eye of stock that had come from a place that knew what it was doing. A place that had been sound once and could be sound again. He had seen enough failing country in his life to know what land looked like when it had been let go on purpose, and this land looked like exactly that. He sat his horse at the fence a long while and read the ground, the lay of the draw, the dark line of the seep where the water was standing wrong. Then he turned and rode back toward town to work out how a man might come at the widow Haywood without sounding like every other man who had ridden up to tell her what was wrong with her. She was in the yard when he came up the track, a woman in a faded work dress with her hair pinned back off her face, a feed bucket balanced on one hip. And she stopped and waited for him with the stillness of a person who has learned that most arrivals cost her something. A boy stood at the porch rail, 12 years old maybe. with his mother's coloring and the grave closed face of a child who has been the man of a place a good deal longer than the job should have fallen to him. Ezra stepped down at the gate and took his hat off. He gave her his name and told her he had ridden past her water that morning and that he believed he knew what was wrong with it. She set the bucket down in the dirt and folded her arms. "The men I've paid to look thought they knew too," she said. "Above the third gate," he said, and kept his voice level, "where the draw narrows and the line crosses the seep. Your spring box has caved and the line under it has broken at the joint. The spring is not giving out. It is choking. The water backs up there and drowns the seep, and your meadow pays for it twice over, wet when it should be draining and dry when it should be holding." Cora Haywood looked at him. It was not the look of a woman deciding whether to trust a stranger. It was the look of a person who has just been told a true thing after a long stretch of being told things that were not. "That is where I have known it was," she said. "It is," he said. She was quiet a moment. "What is it you're asking?" He told her he would fix what he had found. He would sleep in the barn with the horses and be no trouble to her. He would ask for nothing else, and when the water ran clean again, he would move on. She looked at him a long time. The boy had come down off the porch steps and was standing at her side by then. "All right," she said. She picked the feed bucket back up and went on toward the chickens as though the matter were already ordinary. The boy stayed at the gate. "I'm Caleb," he said, and put his hand out the way a grown man would. "Ezra," he said, and took it. "You've been up that draw. I know right where the box is," the boy said. "I helped my pa set the last one before he got sick." "Then you'll be worth having along," Ezra said, and Caleb held the gate open, and Ezra led his horse through. He put his bedroll down in the empty stall at the end of the barn that first night, in among the smell of hay and horse and cold iron, and the stock shifted and blew at the stranger for the better part of an hour, and then took him for a part of the place and slept. He was up before the house every morning after. Caleb, coming out grey-eyed to the chores, took to finding him already there with a horse's foot in his lap, or a lantern hung up the drawer at the spring. And the boy stopped being surprised by it, and then stopped being wary of it, which in a child who had taught himself to be wary of everything was by far the larger thing. They started on the spring line the first week of May, the ground still holding the cold of a slow spring down where the spade went in. Cora came out at first light with 2 cups off the stove and set one on the rail near where he worked, without a word, and then went to turn the horses into the near pasture. He worked without hurry and without a wasted motion, and when he had the ground opened above the third gate, the caved box showed itself exactly where she had said it would be. The cribbing rotted and folded, the line below it parted clean at the joint. He crouched over it with both hands down in the wet timber and looked up at her. "How long have you known?" he said. 3 years, she told him. He nodded and went back to it. She told him where the old line ran under the sod, and where the frost bit hardest and heaved the joints, and what the clay did in a long dry spell. And he took her direction without once questioning it, because he had the craft of water and pressure and grade. And she had the thing no craft could give a man, which was 30 years of watching one particular piece of ground do what it did. He listened, and he dug. By the second week, Caleb was beside him every morning, asking questions, and Ezra gave him the whole of every answer, the real one, and not the version with the hard parts filed off. And the boy already knew things. He knew them because Cora had taught him, and the plainness and accuracy of what he knew settled somewhere down in Ezra without any comment, the way a plumb bob settles when it finally hangs still. There was a morning she stopped him. He had the new line staked to run dead straight down the fall of the draw, which is how a man builds a line who trusts his level over his ground. And she came up from the meadow and looked at the stakes a while and told him the frost took that low straight stretch every winter, had taken it every winter she could remember, because the cold pooled in the bottom of the draw and sat there and did not move. "Run it wide along the bench," she said, "even if it costs you 10 rod of pipe." He looked at the level in his hand, and then at the low ground, and then at her. And he saw that she had the right of it, that a line laid straight down that fall would heave itself apart at the joints by the second winter, and that he would be long gone by then, and she would be the one down in the cold, digging it out, alone. He pulled the stakes and ran it wide along the bench the way she told him to. He said little about it, but he built it her way from there on, and he asked her before he set a joint, and the asking was not a courtesy. It was a man who had learned that the ground under his boots knew things his craft did not. There was a colt in the far pen, a leggy sorrel out of the mare Nate had prized, and Caleb was raising it himself, and doing it half right and half by guess. Ezra watched the boy fight the colt over its feet one evening and then, saying little, showed him how to ask instead of make, how to let the animal lean its own weight into a thing before you took it. Caleb picked it up faster than a boy his age had any business doing, and something in his face came a little unlatched over it, the way a thing comes unlatched that has been shut a long while. He taught the boy other things too. In the offhand way he taught everything, never once sitting him down to it, only handing him the next piece as they came to it. How to read the color of a seep for how deep the water sat under it. How to tell from the set of the grass where the buried line ran without ever opening the ground. How to know from the way a spring came up out of the dark, whether it was truly failing or only fouled and waiting. Cora heard it from the meadow, the boy's questions and the man's full plain answers. And she thought that whatever else came of any of this, her son was being handed a trade, and being handed it by a man who did not once make him feel small for not already having it. Some days that was worth more to her than the water itself. By the third week they were cribbing the spring box new, green timber and creekstone, and clearing the drowned seep, and relaying the broken line joint by patient joint down toward the meadow. By the last of May, the box held, and the head of water came down the line for the first time in 3 years, the way the grade had always meant it to. By June the meadow was taking that water and drinking it down instead of standing in it. And when the first real summer rain came, and the ground held the rain properly and let the excess go, Cora walked out and stood at the edge of the meadow in the grey of the morning, with her boots in the wet grass, and looked at it a long time, and did not say anything at all. Then she went back to the house and made breakfast. There had been a cold snap early in the work, a hard, clear night with frost furring the rails. And that evening Cora had carried the good blanket out to the barn, the heavy striped wool one from the cedar chest that she kept for company and never used, and left it folded over the stall rail for the man sleeping with the horses. She had not said anything about it, and neither had he. A week on, after the snap had broken, she found the blanket back on the porch rail, aired and beaten clean, and folded down into a neat square. She stood on the step a moment looking at it. Then she took it inside and put it away. The evenings had changed their shape without anyone deciding they should. Ezra had eaten alone in the barn the first week, a plate carried out and a plate carried back. But somewhere down in the digging of the line that had quietly stopped, and he took his supper at the table now with the boy between them. And the talk ran to grade and gait and the off-feet of horses, and never once ran dry. Caleb, who had learned to hold still and keep his own counsel the way a boy does when a house goes quiet with grief, had started talking again, whole suppers of it. And Cora let it fill the kitchen and did not hush him. She caught herself some nights having stopped listening for a wagon on the road, that old braced listening of a woman alone who has learned most arrivals cost her something. She noticed it and made nothing of it, and cleared the plates and banked the stove for the night. If you have ever been the one in the room who could see the thing plainly while everyone around you agreed to look past it, stay with this one, because it is about to turn. Julia said her piece in June. Cora had come into Pell's for muslin and thread, and the woman leaned across the bolts of cloth with her voice already arranged to pass for concern. "People are starting to talk, Cora," she said. "A man living in your barn all spring and into summer." Cora set her bolt of muslin on the counter and looked past Julia to Harmon Pell behind the register, who was polishing a jar that had been clean when he picked it up. Pell had kept accounts in that valley long enough to know the sound of men calling a thing cursed because they had decided to want it cheap. And Cora had always suspected he knew a good deal more than he ever put words to. Nate hired men every spring he was able, she said, with her eyes on Pell and not on Julia. Nobody found their tongue about it then. Julia drew herself up. That was a different matter, she said. He had a wife. Cora picked up the muslin and moved toward the register. Yes, she said. He did. She paid, and she left. By the week after, she could feel it moving through the town, the glances that held a half-second past where a glance should stop, the low talk that changed its shape when she came near. She felt it, and she marked it, and she went on with what wanted doing. Because the meadow was greening, and the tank was filling, and there was no argument in the world she could win by staying to have it. The hay came off the home meadow in July in a full heavy cutting, the first in 3 years that was worth the cutting. And Ezra worked it alongside them and made no remark on the yield, which was its own kind of remark. Caleb rode the rake and stacked with them and kept his own colt turned out where he could watch it between loads. And once when Cora looked up, he was grinning at the animal across the fence the way he used to grin at things in the years before Nate got sick, before the boy had gone quiet and careful and old. She looked away before he could catch her seeing it. She did not have to sell a single head that fall. For the first time since the sickness took Nate, the horses stayed, all of them, and the colt with them. And the ranch went into the cold with more standing in the meadow and more grain in the crib than it had carried in a long time. It was the following spring that gave the game away, when the lower meadow came up in a full even stand of grass where there had been 3 seasons of failure. And it was that, more than the horses, more than the hay, that finally set the valley to asking the questions it should have asked all along. And what came out, when it came, was not a complicated thing. Each time Shaw had ridden up to look at the Haywood water, and each time Boyd had, they had understood exactly what the spring line needed, as well as Ezra had understood it. And they had said nothing, because the ground they were calling a dry hole was ground they meant to buy at a dry hole's price. One of them had gone to a land broker down at the county seat the week after his second visit, and had talked figures, and had let it be known the widow could not hold on much longer. There was a canal survey coming up the valley, was the root of it. Whoever held Cold Spring when it came would hold the only sure water in that whole stretch of range, and men who buy up the sure water in dry country do not have to farm at all to grow rich. It was Harmon Pell who told her on a Tuesday in March, standing just inside her kitchen door with his hat held in both hands, wearing the face of a man who has carried a thing too long and knows it and cannot put it down anywhere but here. She heard the whole of it through without stopping him. When he had finished, she said, "Thank you, Harmon," and he nodded and put his hat on and went. She sat at the kitchen table a long time after the door closed. The stove ticked as it cooled. The horses moved in the pen outside, and she could hear Caleb's voice, and then Ezra's carrying up from the corral, something about a filly's off-hind. The boy asking and the man answering the way they always answered each other now. The anger that came up in her chest was clean and cold, and it was not the anger of surprise. It was the anger of confirmation, which is a different thing and carries a different weight, because it settles onto ground you already knew was there. She had not been fooled. She had been outmaneuvered. She had known the truth of her own water for 3 years and had watched 2 men use her knowing of it against her, betting she could not act on it alone. And they had bet right. For 3 long years they had bet right. And she had sat inside those 3 years believing in some corner of herself that maybe the men were correct and she was the fool. That was the part that burned. She did not ride to the county seat. She did not go to Shaw's gate or to Boyd's with the thing held out in her hands, because there was nothing in her hands that a court would weigh. Only 2 men who had looked at her water and lied by holding their tongues, and a man cannot be hauled up for the words he chooses not to say. What she had instead was the water itself, running clean down the line laid the way she had told him to lay it, and a meadow that would stand up that coming summer in a full even crop, where 3 years of failure had been, out in front of the whole valley, undeniable and green. Let them drive past that, she thought. Let them put a dry hole's price on that by the acre. The land would say the thing she could never prove, and it would say it loud enough and long enough that no broker's figure would ever quiet it again. She found Ezra at the workbench in the barn an hour later, fitting a new valve to the branch line that fed the lower pasture. She stood in the doorway until he looked up, and then she told him what Pell had told her. He set the valve down on the bench. The quiet that came after it was not his ordinary quiet. There was something behind this one that he was not going to dress up or perform for her. Then he picked the valve back up and turned it over in his hands. "I heard them that first night," he said. "In the saloon. They were putting a price to your acreage by the acre, with nobody to sell it." She looked at him. "Then you knew what they were," she said, "from the start." "I knew what kind of men they were," he said, and set the valve back down. "I did not know the whole of the rest of it until just now, the same as you." She held his eye a moment and found in it the thing she had been half afraid she would not find, which was that he was telling her the truth. Then she went back up to the house and started supper. He came in when the light outside had gone blue and washed his hands at the pump on the porch and sat down at the table without being asked, the way he had come to. She set a plate in front of him. Caleb sat between them and talked the whole meal about the filly and the canal survey both at once, and the two of them answered him in turns, and the ordinary evening closed over the day and held. The last of the second haying was in by the 3rd week of October, the meadow shorn and resting, and the barn stacked to the beams, the air carrying the smell of cured grass and fallen leaves, and low underneath it, the first true cold of the year. They had walked the meadow line together after supper the way they had gotten into the habit of doing, checking the seep, or telling themselves that was why they walked it. He stopped before she did. She took another step or two and felt him fall out of stride behind her and turned back. He was standing looking out over the shorn meadow the way he looked at a piece of work he had finished and found good, not with any pride in it, but with something quieter than pride. The settling of a man who has done the thing he came to do and finds he is in no hurry at all to leave it behind him. He looked at her. "I want to stay on," he said, and kept his voice level. "Not as a hired man. For good. This is as fine a piece of water as any I have worked in my life, and the boy has a few years yet before he can run it the way it needs running, and by the time he can, I would like to know this ground the way you know it." He held her eye. "I would like to know it with you." He reached into his coat pocket and put his hand out, open. In his palm lay a plain iron ring, worn smooth with carrying, not new, not bought that week or that year. The kind of thing a man keeps in a pocket a long time before he understands what it is for. "Marry me," he said. She looked at the ring, and then she looked at him, at the steadiness of him that was the same steadiness she had watched down in the trench and at the workbench and across her own table night after night. The kind of steadiness that never once performs itself because it has never had the need. Her throat moved. "The boy already believes you're staying," she said. "He quit asking me about it weeks ago," Ezra said. The corner of his mouth shifted, not all the way to a smile, only far enough to own that it was one. She reached out and took the ring up out of his palm. "Yes," she said. He closed both his hands around hers with the ring inside it and held it there a moment. Not long, only long enough. And then he let go. They stood out at the meadow line a while more, and then walked back toward the house together through the long, low light of the October evening. They married in June. Harmon Pell gave a short toast that surprised the room by how well it landed, and Caleb stood up front beside Ezra, with his hair combed flat and his boots blacked. Wearing the look he had been wearing since the October evening, he had come up from the corral and found the two of them already back at the house and being very careful not to look at each other. By the season after, the Haywood place was running more good horses and cutting more hay to the acre than most spreads in the district, and buyers were coming from 2 counties over for the stock, and the hay went at the top of the market 3 years running. Shaw and Boyd still drove past the fence line on their way to town. They did not stop. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Cora came out onto the porch to find Caleb sitting on the steps working a stone out of his boot heel. The whole yard loud with birds and with the horses moving through the far pasture in the early light. She handed him the wrapped loaf for Pell's standing order, folded up in the good striped blanket from the cedar chest, because she did not save the good things back for company anymore. He took it and looked at it, and looked up at her, and left the second boot alone and stood and went down the steps with it under his arm. He was already out on the road when she turned back toward the door. From behind the house came the sound of Ezra at the pump, the long, even clank of the handle, and the water coming up out of the ground cold and clean and steady, out of the ground that every man in that valley but one had agreed to call dry. She went inside and started the morning. And that was the story of Korah, and of her son Caleb, and of the man who rode past their water on an April morning and saw the thing that everyone else had chosen not to see. Tell me down in the comments if this one stayed with you, and where in the world you are listening from. Thank you for being here.